She fought off wolves to save a Comanche boy. Then, his father sought to marry her. The unforgiving prairie was a canvas of raw isolation, quiet defiance, and a sorrow as deep as the canyons. Here, on the edge of a world that had cast her out, Leah rammed another cartridge into her Winchester. The wolf's snarl was a blade in the twilight, but her hands were steady, her face a mask of cold fury, the kind of grit a woman earns when she's got nothing left to lose. The Comanche boy's terrified cry wasn't just a stranger's plea, it was an echo, a ghost of another small voice she'd once failed to save. She fired the shot, ripping through the silence. The beast scattered. The child was safe. But as she looked into his dark, trusting eyes, a new fear coiled in her gut. She knew this land. An act of salvation was also a blood debt. She had saved a chief's son from wolves, but she had no idea his father's price for that life would be hers. The wind was the only constant companion Leah had. It was a sculptor carving loneliness into the vast, open canvas of the prairie. It whispered through the thin walls of her cabin a dry, mournful sound that spoke of dust and distance. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the bruised purple clouds in strokes of fiery orange. Another day was dying. Another day survived. Leah stood on her porch, a tin cup of lukewarm water in her hand. Her gaze swept the endless sea of swaying straw-colored grass. This land didn't forgive. It took. It had taken her husband, leaving her with nothing but a half-finished fence and the cold judgment of the townsfolk who whispered the word "cursed" behind her back. They thought her weak, a wilting flower left to be consumed by the elements. They were wrong. Grief had burned away her weakness, leaving something harder in its place. Something like iron. Her hands, though slender, were calloused from mending the fence, tilling the stubborn soil, and handling the cold, heavy steel of her late husband's Winchester. She moved through her chores with a grim, practiced efficiency, each action a small rebellion against the encroaching silence. Chop the wood, draw the water, mend the roof, survive. It was in the deepest quiet of the evening, as the world held its breath between sunset and moonrise, that she heard it. A sound that did not belong. It was thin, reedy, ripped from a small throat and carried on the uncaring wind. A cry. Leah froze the wood axe halfway through its swing. Her heart, a slow and steady drum of lonely survival, suddenly hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to bar the door, to ignore the sound. The prairie was full of tricks. Coyotes could sound like babies crying a cruel lure for the soft-hearted. She was not soft-hearted, not anymore. But then it came again, closer this time. Higher, sharper. It was a sound of pure, undiluted terror. It was the sound of a child, and it cracked open a part of her soul she had long since buried under a small, unmarked cross of stones. She didn't think. She acted. The axe fell from her hand, thudding into the dirt. She was inside the cabin in a flash, her hands closing around the familiar worn stock of the rifle. It felt like an extension of her arm, a cold, hard piece of the resolve that now defined her. She burst back out into the twilight, her bare feet flying over the packed earth, running toward the sound. She found them near the rocky outcropping that marked the edge of her property. A small form of boy was backed against a slab of granite, and circling him, their eyes glowing like malevolent embers in the dim light, were 3 gaunt timber wolves. Their movements were a fluid, patient dance of death. Their lips were pulled back in silent snarls, revealing yellowed fangs. They were done playing. They were closing in for the kill. Leah raised the Winchester to her shoulder, the metal cool against her cheek. She didn't aim at the wolves. A wounded wolf was a desperate, unpredictable beast. She aimed a foot above the largest one's head. The shot shattered the evening stillness. The explosion of sound and fire was a violent intrusion into their primal world. The lead wolf yelped and sprang back, confused. The others hesitated, their predatory focus broken. "Get!" Leah's voice was a raw, guttural roar she didn't recognize as her own. "Get away from him!" She worked the lever, the metallic shkashk, a sound of deadly promise. She fired again, this time into the dirt at their paws, kicking up a spray of rock and dust. That was enough. With a final frustrated snarl, the pack turned and vanished into the shadows, melting back into the prairie that had spawned them. Silence descended, heavy and ringing. Leah's breath came in ragged gasps, the adrenaline afire in her veins. She lowered the rifle, her eyes fixed on the small figure still pressed against the rock. He was a child, no older than 6 or 7. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, his small body trembling. His dark hair was matted with sweat, and a single feather was tied into one of his braids. His clothes were not the rough spun cotton of the town. They were buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork. He was Comanche. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This changed everything. This was not just a lost child. This was a spark in a tinderbox of hostility and fear. Helping him was a danger far greater than any wolf. Slowly, she knelt, laying the rifle on the ground beside her to show she meant no harm. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice softer, now gentler. "They're gone. You're safe." The boy stared at her, his dark eyes wide with a fear that went beyond the wolves. He was seeing her a white woman, a ghost from a world that had only ever brought his people pain. He was bleeding a long, shallow gash on his arm, where a claw had found its mark. Without thinking, Leah tore a strip from the hem of her own dress and reached for him. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. Her touch was impossibly gentle as she cleaned the wound and tied the makeshift bandage. In the dim light, she saw his fear begin to recede, replaced by a dazed curiosity. He was just a boy, lost and hurt. "Come on," she said, her voice barely a murmur. "Let's get you inside." She led him back to the cabin, a small, trusting hand eventually finding its way into hers. Inside the warmth of the stove was a comfort against the growing chill of the night. She gave him water, which he drank thirstily, and a piece of dried jerky which he eyed with suspicion before taking a small, tentative bite. For an hour they sat in a strange, shared silence, two outcasts from different worlds huddled together against the vast, dark prairie. A fragile peace settled in Leah's heart, a feeling she hadn't known in years. It was a feeling that was brutally shattered when she glanced out the small, grimy window. Out on the horizon, silhouetted against the rising moon, were riders. Not 1 or 2. A dozen, maybe more. They weren't settlers. Their forms were lean, their posture born of a life in the saddle. They moved with the silent, purposeful grace of hunters who had found their prey. They were coming for the boy, and they were coming for her. The riders did not thunder across the prairie. They flowed, a silent, inexorable river of shadow and steel under the bone-white light of the moon. They were a dozen men, maybe more, their forms lean and hard-moving, with a unity that spoke of 1,000 shared miles and a single, unbending purpose. The rhythmic beat of their horses' hooves was a low, guttural drum against the earth, a sound that vibrated up through the soles of Leah's feet and into her very bones. Fear, cold and sharp, seized her. It was the town's fear, a poison she had been fed for years. Stories of raids of fire, of brutal painted faces in the night. Her first instinct was to bolt the door to hide the boy, to pray they would pass. But then she looked down. The child Tavika had felt her terror. He had let go of the jerky, and his small hand was now clutching the fabric of her worn dress, his dark eyes fixed on her face. He was not looking at the riders. He was looking at her, his protector. In his gaze there was no fear of the men outside. Only a question. "Will you keep me safe?" That single, silent question extinguished her fear, replacing it with something far more powerful. A fierce, defiant resolve. She had not saved this child from the teeth of wolves only to surrender him to the swords of men. She placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice a low command. "Do not make a sound." She rose, her movements deliberate, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She did not take the rifle. This would not be a battle of bullets. This was something else. She pulled the cabin door open and stepped out onto the porch, letting the moonlight fall upon her, a solitary woman in a simple dress waiting. The river of riders slowed, splitting to encircle the cabin in a loose, inescapable cordon. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of horse sweat, leather, and a palpable waiting tension. A single rider dismounted. He moved with an unnerving grace, not the bow-legged swagger of a cowboy, but the fluid confidence of a predator. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face a chiseled mask of hard angles and profound sorrow. A jagged scar, old and white, cut a path from his temple to his jaw, a road map of past violence. This was not just a warrior. He was a leader. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept past Leah as if she were nothing more than a part of the landscape, his gaze fixed on the dark maw of the cabin door. He was searching. "You have something that belongs to me," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority, a low rumble like distant thunder. It was not a question. Leah's throat was dry as dust. She swallowed, her own voice coming out steadier than she felt. "There is a child here. He was lost. The wolves?" The man's eyes snapped to hers, and for the first time she felt the full force of his presence. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff. He took a step forward, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife at his belt. "My son," he said, the words tight, each one a piece of flint. "Where is he?" The air crackled. She could feel the unseen eyes of the other riders on her, a dozen arrows aimed at her heart. One wrong move, one flicker of what they might perceive as a threat, and her life would be over. "He is safe," Leah said, forcing a calm she did not possess. "He is hurt, but not badly. He is inside." The man Kavi did not move. His gaze was a physical weight, pinning her in place, searching her for any hint of deception. He had prepared himself for a trail of blood, for a ransom note, for the devastating silence of a final loss. He had not prepared himself for this. A lone white woman, unarmed, on her porch, speaking of safety. Leah held his gaze, her heart pounding a frantic prayer. She turned her head slightly toward the open door. "Tavika," she called softly. "It is all right. You can come out." For a long, agonizing moment there was nothing. Then a small shadow appeared in the doorway. The boy hesitated, blinking in the moonlight, his small frame dwarfed by the immense tension of the scene. He saw the riders. He saw the tall man standing before the porch. "Father," he whispered, the single word, a fragile bird in the vast, silent night. The warrior's stone-like composure shattered. The iron mask of command fell away, revealing a father's naked, desperate relief. Tavika Kavi breathed, and he strode forward, sweeping the boy up into his arms, crushing him to his chest, his eyes closing as he buried his face in his son's hair. The other riders let out a collective, audible sigh, the taut string of their aggression suddenly cut. Leah watched her own knees, feeling weak. She had been so focused on the danger she had forgotten the grief that must have been driving them. After a long moment, Kavi set his son down, his hands examining the boy from head to toe. His fingers traced the crude bandage on Taveka's arm. He looked at the clean tear in Leah's dress. He looked at the dead embers of the fire through the window. He looked at the tracks of the wolves still visible in the dust. He was a man who could read the land, and the story it told was clear. He turned back to Leah. The fury in his eyes was gone. The suspicion was gone. In their place was something far more intimidating, a profound, immeasurable debt. He stood before her, a mountain of a man, and gave a slow, formal nod. "You saved my son," he stated, his voice now imbued with a solemn gravity. "You saved my bloodline. This is a debt that cannot be paid with horses or hides." Leah simply shook her head. He was a child. Anyone would have... No, Kavi interrupted, his voice absolute. Not anyone. You. He took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. My life belongs to my people. My son's life is my people. For this, our laws demand a bond that cannot be broken. To protect you, to honor you, you will become one of us. Leah stared at him, confused, a cold dread beginning to creep back into her veins. I don't understand. Kavi's next words fell like stones, each one landing with a terrible, world-altering weight. I will take you as my wife. The world narrowed to the space between them. The moon, the stars, the vast breathing prairie had all vanished, swallowed by the gravity of his words. I will take you as my wife. Leah's breath hitched. The words were not a soft whisper of courtship. They were stones dropped into the silent well of her life, and the ripples were tidal waves. She felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the solid ground beneath her feet had turned to sand. One moment, she was the rescuer, the woman of iron who had faced down wolves. The next, she was a prize, a debt to be settled. No, she finally managed to say the word small, fragile against the weight of his declaration. She took a step back, her hand rising to her throat. That's impossible. You can't. Kavi's expression did not change. There was no anger in his eyes, no offense, only an unyielding, solemn certainty. I can, he said, his voice calm, rational. It was the calm that terrified her most. It is the only way. You are a woman alone. The land is hard. The men in your town, they do not respect you, they whisper your name like a curse. How could he know that? Had he been watching her? The thought sent a chill down her spine. I have protected myself, she countered, a tremor of her old defiance returning. I don't need. You saved the son of a war chief, he cut in, his voice taking on a harder edge. The news of this will travel on the wind. My enemies will hear of it. They will see you as a weakness to strike at me. The men of your own town, they will see a woman who consorts with the Comanche. They will not offer you protection. They will offer you a rope or a torch. His logic was a cage, each bar forged from a truth she could not deny. He was not claiming her out of desire. He was claiming her out of a rigid, inescapable code of honor that was as much a part of this land as the rocks and the sky. This is not a request, Kavi said, his gaze sweeping over her small, vulnerable cabin. It is a shield. My name will be your shield. My people will be your family. It is the law of my heart, and it is the only payment for the life of my son. He turned to Teveka, murmuring something in his own tongue. The boy, his eyes heavy with sleep, nodded and leaned against his father's leg. Kavi then gave a sharp, low whistle. The river of riders stirred, their mission of rescue now complete. He mounted his horse in one fluid motion, pulling his son up to sit before him. He looked down at Leah one last time. 2 of my best men will remain, he said. They will watch over you. They will keep you safe until I return to bring you home. And with that, he turned his horse. The Comanche war party moved as one, a whisper of sound, and melted back into the vast, dark prairie, leaving behind only the tracks in the dust and 2 silent, immovable figures. They stood at the edge of her property, one near the crude barn, the other by the path leading to the creek. They were armed with rifles and a stillness that was more intimidating than any threat. They were statues of bronze and leather, their faces impassive, their dark eyes watching. Guards, or jailers. Leah stumbled back into her cabin, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. She bolted the door, a useless gesture. The cage was not her cabin, it was the entire prairie, and its bars were the unwavering gaze of the 2 warriors outside. The next day dawned gray and oppressive. Leah went about her chores in a daze. The simple act of drawing water from the well became a performance under the watchful eyes of her guardians. The silence, once a familiar companion, was now thick with their presence. She was no longer just lonely. She was watched. She was claimed. Late in the afternoon, she saw a flicker of movement on the horizon, a lone rider from the direction of the town. It was Jed, a nosy rancher who sometimes let his cattle graze too close to her land. He rode near, saw the two Comanche warriors standing sentinel, and his eyes went wide with a mixture of fear and salacious excitement. He didn't approach. He just stared for a long moment, then wheeled his horse around and galloped back towards town, a man carrying a lit match to a barrel of gunpowder. Leah's stomach tightened into a cold knot. She knew what would happen next. By dusk, the news had found its home in the smoky, sour-smelling air of the Harmony Creek saloon. Two of 'em, Jed's voice was loud important, just standing there, like they own the place. And her, not a sign of her. They've taken her, I tell you. That cursed woman has brought the whole hornet's nest down on us. A grim-faced man at the bar slammed his glass down. I knew it. Always said she was no good. Consorting with savages. She's probably in on it with them. The town's fear, always simmering just beneath the surface, began to boil. Back at the cabin, the sun set and the chill returned. Leah, wrestling with her own fear, did something impulsive. She poured 2 cups of fresh, cool water and walked out onto the porch. She approached the nearer of the 2 guards, her steps slow. He watched her, his hand never leaving his rifle. He was young, his face still holding a trace of the boy he once was. She held out a cup. Water. She said the single word, feeling foolish and small. He stared at the cup, then at her face. For a long moment he did nothing. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, he took it. He drank it down in 3 long swallows, his eyes never leaving hers, and handed the empty cup back. He spoke no word of thanks, but the gesture was a crack in the wall of her fear. He was not a monster. He was a thirsty man. She turned to go back inside, a flicker of something new, not hope, but a less profound loneliness warming her. But as she reached the door, she looked past the silent warrior, out towards the distant hazy glow of Harmony Creek. She had thought Kavi's proposal was a cage. But now, seeing the angry, fearful light of the town, she wondered which side of her fence held the real savages in Harmony Creek. Fear had found a voice, and that voice belonged to Preacher Miller. He stood on a makeshift pulpit of stacked crates in the center of town, his face flushed with a righteous fire, his shadow long and sharp in the afternoon sun. The townsfolk were gathered before him, a grim congregation of farmers, with work-worn hands, shopkeepers with narrowed eyes, and women clutching Bibles like shields. Jed the rancher's story had spread like a prairie fire, fanned by years of suspicion and whispered gossip. The hand of evil has reached into our valley. Miller's voice boomed, echoing off the false fronts of the buildings. That woman, that Leah, who has lived under a cloud of curse since the day her husband was taken, she has finally shown her true colors. She has summoned the heathen to her doorstep. A low, angry murmur rippled through the crowd. They hold her captive, you say, a man shouted. Miller's smile was thin, cruel. A willing captive, I fear. She has turned her back on her own kind, on God's law, and embraced the darkness. We cannot suffer this blight to fester at our borders. We go now to deliver her from her sin and to cleanse our land of the shadows she has welcomed. He spoke of salvation, but his eyes promised damnation. He spoke of rescue, but his hands were clenched for violence. They were not a posse seeking justice. They were a mob seeking a sacrifice. They gathered their weapons, old farm rifles, rusted pitchforks, and torches soaked in oil, ready to bring their terrible purifying light into the darkness. Back at the cabin, an unnatural quiet had fallen. The wind had died and the air was heavy expectant. Leah felt it in her bones, a low thrum of approaching danger. She stood by the window, watching the 2 Comanche guards. They were no longer resting. They stood alert, their bodies coiled springs of tension, their gaze fixed on the low ridge that separated her land from the town. They knew. The land had warned them. The younger guard, the one who had taken her water, caught her eye. He gave a single sharp nod toward the ridge. It was not a warning. It was a confirmation of a fate he had already accepted. They would not run. They would stand their ground. They would die here, protecting a white woman who was no part of their world, all for the sake of their leader's honor. The sight of their quiet courage shamed her. What had her own people ever offered her scorn? Isolation, the brand of a curse. These strangers, these savages, were offering their very lives. Then she saw them, a crawling, dark line on the crest of the hill, a beast with many heads glinting with metal and fire under the dying sun. The mob. They moved with a clumsy, uncoordinated purpose, a wave of righteous hatred rolling across the prairie. The younger guard let out a low whistle. He and his companion took their positions, one behind the corner of the barn, the other using the well's stone wall as cover. They were preparing to fight an army. The guard near the well looked at her. "Numaka na," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. He pointed to the back of the cabin toward the open prairie. Run. For a heartbeat she considered it. To flee, to leave them to their fate and save herself. But where would she run, back to a world that saw her as a curse, or deeper into a wilderness that would eventually consume her? The mob was closer now. She could hear their shouts, disjointed and ugly. "Leah, we've come to save you." It was Preacher Miller's voice, slick with false concern. "Come out, child, leave the heathens to God's judgment, save her." They had never tried to save her from her loneliness. They had never offered a kind word to save her from her grief. They only wanted to save her from her choice to drag her back into the cage of their approval. She looked from the approaching torches to the two warriors preparing to die for a promise. The choice was never a choice at all. Her heart did not pound. It settled. A cold, clear certainty washed over her, cleansing the last of her fear. She did not run. She walked to the cabin door and slammed the heavy wooden bolt into place. The sound was a thunderclap in the quiet room. It was the sound of a border being drawn, a final allegiance declared. She grabbed the Winchester. The weight was familiar, comforting. She moved to the window, peering out from the side of the grimy glass. The younger guard saw the door bolt. He saw her raise the rifle. His stoic expression flickered with surprise and then a dawning, profound respect. The mob saw it too. They stopped a ragged line of confusion and disbelief 50 yards from the cabin. "What is she doing?" someone yelled. Preacher Miller's face contorted, his mask of salvation twisting into a snarl of pure rage. "See," he shrieked, his voice cracking with fury. "It is as I said. She is one of them. She has chosen her master, and it is the devil. Burn them all." A torch flew through the air, a fiery arc against the bruised twilight sky. It landed on the dry roof of the porch, and a small, hungry flame licked at the wood. Leah raised the rifle, resting the barrel on the windowsill. Her world, once as vast and empty as the prairie, had shrunk to this small patch of land. This wooden fortress. This last desperate stand. The fire had been chosen for her. Now she would answer with fire of her own. The torch did not just set fire to the wood. It set fire to the world. A hungry orange flame clawed at the dry timber of the porch roof, casting a flickering, monstrous light on the faces of the mob. Their righteousness was now illuminated, and it was ugly. Leah did not hesitate. The Winchester kicked hard against her shoulder, not a tool of murder but of defiance. She fired high, her bullet tearing through the shingles just beside the flame, sending a shower of burning splinters onto the man who threw it. He shrieked and scrambled back, his courage extinguished as quickly as it had been lit. That single shot was the signal. The mob's ragged discipline broke, and the night erupted in a cacophony of panicked gunfire. Bullets ripped through the thin walls of the cabin. A slug slammed into the doorframe beside Leah's head, showering her face with splinters. Glass shattered. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the stink of burning pine. It was a storm of lead and hate, and she was at its very center. She dropped to the floor, crawling from one window to the next, a ghost in her own home. Fire when you see a target. Cycle the action. Fire again. Her movements were mechanical, her mind a cold, clear island in a sea of chaos. She was no longer the town's cursed widow. She was the wrath of a woman with nothing left to burn. Outside, the two Comanche guards moved like phantom dancers in the flashing light. They did not waste bullets. Each shot was a measured, deadly punctuation mark. The younger guard from behind the well took down the legs of a man aiming at the cabin. The other, a blur of motion from the barn, used his knife to sever the reins of the mob's horses, sending them screaming into the night and cutting off any easy escape. They fought with a chilling efficiency, a stark contrast to the clumsy rage-fueled volleys of the townsfolk. But they were only two, and the fire was growing. Smoke began to pour into the cabin, a choking, blinding fog. The roof of the porch groaned, ready to collapse. The heat was becoming unbearable. Leah's eyes stung, her lungs burned. She fired her last cartridge. The metallic click of the empty chamber was a death knell. It was over. They were going to be burned alive. Preacher Miller, seeing his chance, stepped forward from the chaos, his face a demonic mask in the firelight. "It is the fire of the Lord," he screamed. A cleansing fire for the witch and her demons. And then, from the ridge behind them, a new sound split the night. It was not a gunshot. It was a cry, a high, piercing ululation that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the sky. It was a sound of pure, concentrated fury. It was the cry of a hawk descending on its prey. A war cry. The mob faltered, turning toward the sound in confusion, and they saw them. A dozen riders cresting the hill like vengeance itself, Kavi at their head. They were not the solemn party from before. They were painted for war. They crashed into the mob's flank like a tidal wave. There was no battle. It was a rout. The righteous men of Harmony Creek, so brave against one woman and two guards, scattered like quail before the disciplined, overwhelming fury of the Comanche warriors. They screamed, they dropped their weapons, they fled into the darkness, their torches sputtering out in the dirt. Silence fell once more, broken only by the hungry crackle of the fire. Kavi slid from his horse and strode through the smoke, his eyes blazing. He saw the bodies of the mob's horses. The groaning wounded the two guards standing firm. His gaze landed on Leah as she stumbled out of the burning cabin, coughing, her face black with soot, the empty Winchester still clutched in her hands. He stopped before her. The air between them was thick with smoke and unspoken words. "You fought," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of awe. Leah nodded, too exhausted for words. She looked at her home, the porch now a skeleton of black, collapsing timber. Her past was turning to ash before her eyes. Without another word, Kavi began to bark orders in his own tongue. His men acting as one formed a chain to the well, dousing the flames with endless buckets of water. Kavi worked alongside them, his powerful frame moving through the steam and haze, his focus absolute. Leah, her strength returning, joined them, her hands raw, her mind numb. They fought the fire together, a strange, silent army under the moonlight. The settler woman and the Comanche chief beating back the flames of a hatred they now shared. As the last ember died, leaving a smoking black ruin where her porch had been, Kavi stood beside her. He looked at the wreckage, then at her. "Your home is gone," he said, his voice low. She could only nod, watching a final wisp of smoke curl up toward the stars. He met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the sorrow of the scene. "A home of my people is not made of wood that burns," he said softly. "It is made of the people who defend it. You have defended my men. You have defended my honor." He paused, and his next words were not a command, not a debt, but a simple, profound truth. "Come home, Leah." The dawn came soft and gray over a land that smelled of ash. The world was washed clean, stripped bare by the violence of the night. Leah stood amidst the smoking skeletal ruins of her home. The porch was gone. One wall of the cabin was a blackened scar. The life she had known, the lonely, bitter life of the widow on the cursed land, had been burned to the ground. And in its place, a strange and terrible peace. Kavi's words echoed in the quiet space where her heart used to ache. "Come home, Leah." Home. What was that word? It was not these charred timbers. It was not the town of Harmony Creek, a place that had offered her only suspicion and finally a torch. Home had been a memory, a ghost she had tried to cling to in the vast, crushing silence of the prairie. She looked at Kavi. He stood with his men, their work done. They were not gloating victors. They were weary soldiers, their faces calm, their eyes watching her with a new quiet respect. Teveka, his small hand clutching his father's, stared at her with an open, guileless trust that made her breath catch. There was no choice left to make. The world had made it for her. With slow, deliberate steps, Leah walked back into the wreckage. The air inside was thick with the smell of wet soot. Water dripped from the ceiling. Her few possessions were ruined, soaked, and blackened. She passed the broken table, the overturned chair. Her eyes fell on a small wooden box miraculously untouched by the worst of the fire. She knelt and opened it. Inside, nestled on a piece of faded velvet, was a small silver locket. It held a tiny, faded portrait of her late husband, a man with kind eyes and a shy smile. A man from another lifetime. She traced the cool metal with her finger. She had thought this locket was her anchor to the world. Now she knew it had been a stone holding her down in a place of grief. With a quiet click, she closed the locket, and with it a chapter of her life. She slipped it into her pocket. Not a weight to drown her, but a memory to carry forward. She walked back out into the clean morning air. She stopped before Kavi. He was a mountain in the morning light, his presence a promise of either a new prison or a new world. She looked past him at the open prairie stretching to the horizon. It was no longer an enemy. It was a path. "I am ready," she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet dawn. Kavi held her gaze, and in his eyes she saw not the triumphant warrior, but a man who understood the cost of this new beginning. He saw the ashes of her life at her feet, and he respected the sacrifice. He gave a slow, solemn nod. He turned and spoke a few low words to the younger guard, who brought forward a handsome bay mare, its saddle simple but well made. Kavi did not offer to lift her up. He held the reins, an offering of partnership, an invitation to ride as an equal. Leah swung herself into the saddle, her movements sure, her back straight. She looked down at Teveka, who gave her a small, hopeful smile. She looked at Kavi, her protector, her captor, her future. She took one last look at the smoking ruins behind her. There was no sorrow, no regret, only the quiet hum of a new, unwritten song. Together they turned their horses away from the ashes and rode into the rising sun. Leah did not know what lay ahead on that long trail home, but for the first time in a lifetime, she was not alone. She was riding away from a world of ghosts and towards the warmth of a family forged in fire.